Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a reading wrap-up for the end of January and the first couple of days of February. I've gotten a little bit behind on the wrap-up, so I think I may just rush through a bunch of things because I always feel unsatisfied if I don't do them, but at the same time, at a certain point, anything that wasn't brilliant just doesn't stick in the mind quite the same way. Let's go. One of the last things that I read while I was on my vacation was Zadie Smith's The Embassy of Cambodia. This sounds like it should be fitting since I was just on vacation in Cambodia, but this is actually a story that's set in London. It is primarily about a West African immigrant who is working for a rich South Asian family, and their house is in a neighborhood where a Cambodian embassy has just opened up. There's some discussion about what's happening at the embassy. There's apparently a lot of badminton being played in the backyard, but it is mostly about what's happening with this woman's relationship with the family that she is working for, and also about the social structures surrounding their lives. Despite being a book on its own, that I read the ebook, but you could buy this as a bound hardcover. It's really more of a long short story than a short novella. Is that a nitpicky difference? Maybe it is. I'm not sure how much that matters. It was good enough for what it was, but I think it's one of these things where if I were reading it as a short story in a magazine, I probably would have appreciated it more than being in a format where you almost expect something bigger. I think it probably does what it's supposed to do, but it just wasn't supposed to do as much as I was expecting. So it was a little disappointing, but I still thought it was good. Next up is volume 13 of What Did You Eat Yesterday? This is Fumi Yoshinaga's cuisine manga series. This is a series that I often see described incorrectly, because I often see people talk about this as though it were a romance and about a young couple. And it is not. This is a cuisine series about a middle-aged couple who have settled for each other. At this point in the story, the characters are 50 and 53. They're working towards their retirement, and part of their working towards retirement is that they eat frugally, and the recipes are their home cooking. I'm a huge fan of this because I find that a lot of cuisine manga is restaurant type cooking or fancy baking, and this is very much things you could make. It always makes me hungry. It does deal with some interesting bits and pieces of their lives. Both of these guys, in addition to having settled for each other somewhat relationship-wise, are kind of coasting in their careers. One of them is a lawyer, and he's someone who doesn't want to make partner, and his bosses at the law firm are a little bit baffled by the fact that someone in his 50s doesn't want to improve his career more. The other guy is a hairdresser, and he doesn't want to own his own salon. He just wants to work in his boss's salon until his boss retires. And so there's a lot of interesting commentary in that about whether people should be more ambitious and what it means to have career success and relationship success, but also great recipes. But yes, if you're looking for a romance and a young couple, that's not what this is, and I think it's a shame that people go away disappointed often with these, because I often see reviews of people who were unhappy because they were looking for something completely different. But for what this does, I think it does brilliantly, and this is just a great fun series. I always look forward to it. Next up, I read Tommy Orange's There There, which I think almost everyone on BookTube has talked about already. This is a novel that could almost be a short story collection. It follows 10 characters in Oakland, California, who are heading towards a powwow, building up towards a powwow. The extra drama in the background is that we know that certain characters are going to try to rob the prize money from the powwow. This was interesting because based on both a lot of the reviews I had seen and on my impressions from the first 2/3 of the book, I was expecting this to end on a somewhat different note, because the first 2/3 are very much character driven, they're moments in people's lives, and I expected it to end on a moment, but it picks up the plot threads and follows through on them at the end. I'm trying not to spoil this too much, although I think this is the kind of book that can't really be spoiled particularly. But that surprised. I felt like it made the overall novel was a little bit weaker for that. I would have been more satisfied, I think, if we hadn't gotten down into what essentially was an action sequence at the end, which was still well done, but given the strength of the earlier 2/3, I thought it just wasn't quite as impressive or wasn't quite as powerful. That said, I did think it was very good, definitely worth reading. One thing that I thought was actually really interesting was how many Canadian references were in there, more so than I'm used to seeing in American fiction. And I think that was because the framework in which it's viewing them is Indigenous references, and they just happen to be on the other side of the border. But it was interesting to see that kind of cultural presence. I think that's one case where it was so hyped that I don't think it could possibly live up to the hype, even though I still thought it was good. So since that had me wanting to read actual short stories, the next thing that I read was a book of short stories, and that was Take Us to Your Chief by Drew Hayden Taylor. This is a series of science fiction stories that are described as classic sci-fi with a contemporary First Nations outlook. From that, you almost expect this to be more serious than it is, although the cover is clearly kind of goofy. And this actually had a lot of humor in a lot of the stories. It opens with a story about a woman who's the director of a Mohawk radio station, and she accidentally causes the alien invasion, and it starts out in such a reality-based way and goes into this not just science fiction-y, but kind of absurdist place that I thought was really interesting. And that tone continued throughout most of the stories in the book. Not all of them hit for me the same way. There was one involving a sentient AI where the computer ends up evaluating itself in cultural terms, and it ends up comparing basically First Nations religion or philosophy with Christian and Islamic religion and philosophy. And it comes to conclusions based on those two things, but it's an AI that's learned about everything in the world, and it didn't make sense to me that that computer wouldn't have been drawn to Shinto beliefs. That probably sounds odd out of context, but that seemed kind of glaring to me in what the sentient computer was missing out on. That sounds ridiculous now that I say it. But yeah, it actually did make me think that it's surprising that there aren't more alien first contact stories involving indigenous contexts, just because it's so open to metaphor regarding Spanish, Portuguese, English, French colonialism. So yeah, this definitely pointed out a gap in analogies that could be made in science fiction. So this was a lot of fun. It wasn't nearly as serious as I thought, but I was entertained. And I can't remember whose video I was saying this on, but Drew Hayden Taylor writes a bit of everything. I feel like I've read a novel, a graphic novel, and a couple of plays from him, and I know somebody else was reading one of his, I think an essay collection recently. He just does everything. Next up, I read the third volume of Riad Sattouf's Arab of the Future, which is his childhood memoir in which different countries get to be in different colors. So Syria is pink, France is blue. In the first volume they were in Libya for a while. Libya was yellow. It's announced that they're going to go to Saudi, and we get a brighter red at the end, so we'll see if that's where that ends up going. The art is as it has been throughout the series. In this volume I found that I disliked both of the parents even more than I had in the past. The father comes off as even more opinionated and often in ways that don't agree with his previous beliefs, and the mother comes off as even more meek than she had been. She's basically doing nothing, and at this point they've been in Syria 4 years and she still doesn't speak Arabic. He's clearly a choice, and it's not a case where she's around a lot of expats or where she's around a lot of French speakers. There's a point where they go to Lebanon and a lot of people speak French there, so she's happier. So there was a lot about the parents that comes off very poorly, and I think when I talked about volume 2 of this, I had mentioned that the parents have different first names than Riad Sattouf's actual parents' first names. And so in this one, more than in the others, I found myself wondering how much of that was true and how much of that was him making a point about them. Which, as I said, this series hasn't made me wonder about that so much, because I think with most memoirs you assume that a lot of it, just because of the way memory works, it's not necessarily the exact truth. But this made me wonder how much he might have been stretching the truth. And I mean, maybe he wasn't with that, and that's actually how things happened. The other 2 volumes of this I read in the English translation, because I was in Houston and that's what the library had. So this is the first time I've read one of them in the original French, and I didn't feel like it was a huge change in tone. And I know with some translators, you can feel that there are different authors involved in that, and I didn't feel it so much there, so props to the English translator. And finally, a book of a type that I don't normally talk about, but I thought I would anyway, is Millionaire Teacher by Andrew Hallam. This looks like it's a personal finance guide, which I'm not generally interested in because most of them are about the basics and there's only so much of that any one person needs. But this actually goes beyond that and goes into a lot of specifics of investing. The author is Canadian, and so that's why I felt this would be more interesting to pick up, because I feel like a lot of the books about investing are aimed at an American audience, occasionally a British audience, and that's not necessarily as useful. I think for sales purposes, He does include bits in here that are for Americans, for Australians, for Singaporeans, and for British readers, but by and large, because most of his finance writing has been for Money Sense and I think for the Globe and Mail, he's used to writing for a Canadian audience, so I think a lot of this is more useful than a lot of the single audience investment guides are. This is also very conversational, and it does include a couple of chapters that are the personal finance basics, which if you haven't read any of that or are interested in that, I think this makes this more of a package than a lot of books that would be separate personal finance and investing. I hope February has been treating you well. That's it for now. Ciao.